The destruction of a heavy cruiser in sudden darkness is an exercise in extreme kinetic geometry. On August 9, 1942, the United States ship Vincennes was caught in a lethal trap at the Battle of Savo Island. The darkness of Ironbottom Sound shattered as Japanese cruiser float planes dropped bright illumination flares over the American formation. The illumination stripped away visual cover. Instantly, the ship was silhouetted against the night. The Imperial Japanese Navy achieved decisive tactical surprise, collapsing the American reaction to seconds and turning the exchange into a concentrated execution rather than a prolonged duel. The fundamental mechanism of this loss was night action overwhelm. This tactical concept relies on delivering a volume of fire so dense that it outpaces the mechanical and human capacity to absorb, route, and repair damage. In a fiercely compressed window of time, the cruiser absorbed more than 50 recorded heavy gun hits, delivered in a targeted saturation pattern rather than at random. 8-inch armor-piercing rounds and 5-inch high explosive fire tore through the upper works, obliterating communication networks and shattering central command nodes until the ship fractured into isolated compartments fighting without a unified damage control picture. Under that volume of impact, the vessel was pushed past its ability to absorb, route, and repair damage. High explosive detonations severed the main electrical trunks. Without power, the massive main battery turrets could not effectively train onto targets. The steering control failed. Maneuver became erratic and then collapsed, turning a high-speed combatant into a drifting, illuminated target. Topside fires raged unchecked as water mains shattered. The thermal load on the superstructure grew immense. The vessel was effectively immobilized and burning, incapable of effectively returning fire or escaping the focused enemy barrage. While the topside was being dismantled by artillery, the final mechanical failure occurred below the waterline. At least one torpedo, and possibly two, struck the port side of the hull. The hydrodynamic shock of the detonation cracked the ship's protective envelope below the waterline. Flooding surged into lower spaces. The flooding initiated a severe port list. Damage control teams were trapped between the inferno above and the rising ocean below. The combination of catastrophic flooding and rampant structural fires created an irreversible equation. The structural stability of the hull rapidly decayed. There was no margin for recovery, and the human cost was staggering. More than 300 crew members were killed in the cascading destruction. As the internal buoyancy reserves completely failed, the bow of the heavy cruiser dipped beneath the waves, the stern rose, and the massive steel structure began its final descent. Surface gunfire no longer mattered to a ship already committed to the sink. The hull dropped through the water column, leaving the burning surface behind. The moment the ship vanished from the surface, its status permanently changed. It was no longer a combat vessel. It became a static forensic site beyond the reach of human divers, reachable only by heavily engineered robotic systems. The remains of the cruiser and her crew settled into an environment where traditional salvage would be extraordinarily difficult, and where disturbance is constrained by powerful legal and ethical limits. The transition from an active battlefield to an unapproachable resting place was immediate and absolute. The wreckage now waits in the deep, governed by forces far beyond the violent flash of combat, locked in a permanent and legally protected silence. Analyzing a sunken warship means working inside constraints already set by depth and sovereign wargrave status. In Ironbottom Sound, those constraints harden into a denial regime. The main hull rests upright on the seafloor, but investigation must be planned around observation only, with non-disturbance as the default. The first layer of this denial regime is environmental. The vessel lies beyond daylight at a depth of approximately 3,300 feet, roughly 1,000 meters in this sector of Ironbottom Sound, where hydrostatic pressure applies immense force across every surface. Human access ends here, and only robust, heavily engineered robotic systems can operate in the cold, high-pressure water column that isolates the wreck from casual intrusion. Yet even for those machines, the decisive constraint is not physics alone. The second and most impenetrable barrier is jurisdictional. The operation is governed by wargrave ethics and the sovereign immunity that protects naval wrecks from unauthorized disturbance. And this is not a casual guideline. It is a hard legal boundary. No salvage, no artifact recovery, no cutting, no prying, no rearranging the scene to satisfy curiosity. Any activity beyond non-intrusive observation would require formal authorization and strict conditions, and the default posture is preservation. This jurisdictional boundary permanently strips away the conventional toolkit of marine forensics. You cannot cut into the hull to inspect sealed interior spaces. You cannot clear away deep ocean sediment to verify the exact geometry of a localized explosion. The mandate forces a purely observational approach. You trade tactile, physical certainty for the absolute preservation of a sovereign site. Operating heavy robotics around this highly fragile wreckage demands precise restraint. The engineering team must prioritize preservation over curiosity at every moment. If a crucial piece of forensic evidence is hidden behind a fallen door, it must remain hidden. Despite these massive operational limits, there remains a critical institutional requirement to examine the vessel. The primary survey objective is to thoroughly document the existing conditions for long-term heritage management. To protect the site from illegal commercial exploitation or unauthorized interference, governing bodies require an exact baseline of its present state. Establishing this baseline means sending massive remote systems down into an incredibly hostile zone. The risk profile of such an operation is immense, because the warship did not sink cleanly. It was blown apart into jagged fragmentation, and guiding a tethered robotic vehicle through that debris without contact demands absolute discipline. One navigational mistake can snag the cable on torn armor, and any attempt to free a tangle risks pulling against fragile structure in direct violation of the non-disturbance mandate. Operators are boxed into a narrow corner. Lights and cameras require proximity to pierce the water. But law and snag hazards force a rigid standoff, turning every pass into a problem of operational geometry. Optical sensors in the deep ocean are severely handicapped, and even powerful illumination arrays only reach for a few dozen feet. Without a prior map, a camera-first descent forces the vehicle to improvise inside an unmapped hazard field, creating an unacceptable risk of entanglement and unintended contact. Cameras can document detail, but they cannot safely define the geometry of approach on their own. To bypass this sensor limit, marine engineers often separate the mapping phase from the visual phase. The solution relies on acoustic mapping first, then careful visual work. An uncrewed surface vehicle may sweep the area with multi-beam sonar from above, and a deep-rated robotic vehicle can also carry sonar to refine the wreck's shape from closer range without touching it. In one comprehensive survey, an acoustic baseline was built before committing to extended visual passes. In a later return expedition, the same logic applied. Map first, then descend with cameras only when the geometry of the hazard field is understood. The acoustic baseline immediately delivered high-value results. Without entering the physical hazard zone, surface mapping confirmed the main hull's orientation and surviving geometry, producing a point cloud that showed a coherent central structure standing upright on the seafloor. It also traced the borders of the primary debris field and flagged the highest points of vertical relief, giving the engineers a precise hazard map and a clear corridor of safe mud for approach. Yet even with a flawless acoustic map, the hard physical limits of the robotic tether remain an ever-present threat. A map tells you where the sharp edges are, but it does not remove them. The deep ocean currents constantly push against the thousands of feet of cable connecting the surface ship to the robotic cameras below. The vehicle pilots must execute an extreme standoff visual run. They cannot fly over the center of the wreckage and look straight down, because the trailing tether might drift into the superstructure. They must approach from the safe perimeter, treating the invisible acoustic boundary as a solid wall. Every movement is a calculated negotiation between the pull of the current, the weight of the cable, and the proximity of the jagged steel. The acoustic map allows the pilots to position their lighting arrays to cast shadows across the target without ever entering the highest risk zones. Holding a stable standoff run demands patience and rigid discipline as currents work the vehicle and its tether offline. With the acoustic safety perimeter established and the tether hazard managed through precise geometry, the operation can transition to its next critical phase. The uncrewed surface vehicles are recovered and the heavy deep water robotics take over. The robotic cameras drop through the long water column, their lighting systems finally cutting into the dark. The acoustic shadows generated by the sonar map begin to resolve into hard physical evidence. The massive steel structure of the primary hull steps out of the gloom, waiting to reveal its final posture. When the deep-rated cameras light the primary structure, one mechanical detail dominates. The 8-inch main battery turrets stand with their barrels elevated in near unison. The posture reads as a freeze frame of the last driven settings before control failed, leaving an immediately recognizable profile at depth. Moving beyond the frozen turrets, close-range imagery shifts from overall geometry to condition, revealing sharp differences in structural integrity along the length of the surviving hull. Toward the aft section of the cruiser, the hull demonstrates severe catastrophic failure. The stern is heavily collapsed, its shape likely influenced by battle damage and the violence of the final descent and impact on the seabed. The heavy steel plating in the aft section is violently folded and compressed into the mud, completely obscuring the original lines of the quarterdeck and burying any evidence of localized aft damage. Moving forward from the devastated stern, the cameras track along midships and reveal a surprising survivor. Sections of original teak deck planking with grain and linear patterns still visible under harsh robotic lighting after the violent sinking, deep pressure, and decades of immersion. That preservation creates a hard forensic ceiling, with the upper deck largely intact and interior penetration forbidden. Surveyors cannot run cameras through hatches to trace fire paths on lower decks, map internal shock fracturing along armored bulkheads, or directly observe deformation tied to the torpedo strike below the waterline. The exterior can document topside destruction in extraordinary detail, but the internal causality chain remains sealed from view. The survey team must accept this rigid physical limit and continue their track strictly along the exterior of the coherent hull. The robotic cameras push forward, following the line of the main deck to document the forwardmost limits of the primary structure. As the lighting arrays clear the forwardmost turret and the operators prepare to document the bow, the coherent structure abruptly terminates. The massive steel hull simply ends in a sheer drop-off. The entire forward section of the vessel, and along with the towering primary command structure, are completely absent from the main wreckage, leaving a massive void in the deep ocean mud. That missing forward mass forces the survey to expand outward from the coherent hull and locate detached components lying on their own trajectories. By mapping where those heavy sections landed relative to the central structure, engineers can reconstruct the breakup sequence. As a damaged ship falls, drag and acceleration loads exploit compromised joints and weaken bulkheads until major pieces tear away. Acoustic mapping isolated a major detached component well away from the primary structure. The bow appears to have separated during the final descent and followed its own path to the seabed. In survey data also indicate that the primary bridge superstructure is absent from the coherent hull and lies separately within the surrounding debris field. Together, these detached elements sharpen the fragmentation spread and reinforce the same physical reality. Breakup can occur mid-water column when battle-weakened structure meets drag, acceleration, and impact forces it was never designed to endure. While detached element mapping clarifies the breakup sequence at macro scale, the bridge itself imposes a hard forensic limit. The primary bridge superstructure is heavily compressed and partially buried in deep ocean mud, and the violence of impact deformation overprints the battle damage that mattered during the fight. Bound by non-disturbance and unable to clear sediment, the survey cannot resolve fine internal patterns in the command center, including localized fire progression and the precise sequence of communication failures experienced by the crew. The non-intrusive mapping of the detached bow and the separated bridge completes the immediate spatial geometry of the site. The expedition successfully documented the severe fragmentation spread, proving how the deep ocean physically disassembled the cruiser during its final plunge. The separated pieces remain exactly where they fell, independent silent monuments scattered across the dark sea floor. With the complete architectural boundary of the broken ship now thoroughly defined and the absolute limits of forensic proof established, the primary question shifts away from how the vessel broke apart. The focus must now turn to the overarching stability of the entire debris field and the future survival of this shattered steel across multiple generations. Evaluating the deep water stability of a complex steel structure demands time. A single high-resolution survey is only a snapshot. It captures the geometry of destruction, but it cannot reveal the slow, invisible forces still working on the hull. To understand how the deep ocean consumes a sunken warship, marine scientists and heritage managers rely on condition baseline monitoring, Repeat surveys, separated by years, designed to be comparable without ever needing to extract a physical sample. The discipline is not cinematic, it is methodological. Operators plan controlled visual runs that aim for consistent standoff distance, consistent lines of sight, and repeatable lighting where feasible. The goal is not a perfect pixel match. The goal is a defensible comparison, enough overlap to track change, enough restraint to avoid disturbing what must remain untouched. And the deep does not preserve by darkness alone. Corrosion and collapse are shaped by temperature, dissolved oxygen, currents, chemistry, and biology. In cold, deep water, change can be slow. But slow is not the same as stopped, and stability is not the same as permanence. Only measured observation, repeated across time, can turn a wreck from a dramatic image into a documented record of decline. This knowledge gain informs long-term management, but the operating posture does not change. Document, compare, and leave the site undisturbed. Any intrusive sampling, interior penetration, or artifact recovery would require compelling justification and formal authorization, and it remains outside the scope of baseline monitoring. The overarching objective of the mission was an absolute success. The expedition delivered highly accurate boundary maps, confirmed the physical status of the wreckage, and locked a permanent deterioration baseline into the official historical record. All of this was accomplished without violating the sanctity of the sovereign site or risking entanglement in the jagged steel. The heavy cruiser will not be raised, repaired, or physically disturbed for forensic curiosity. It remains where it fell, now defined by accurate boundary maps, a documented condition baseline, and a standing requirement for non-disturbance as time continues to work on the wreck.